Well, it's noon and it's a Friday and you're here with us. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, but as you know, it's every Friday National Minority Quality Forum does these webinars featuring some of our favorite people to discuss and educate some things that are just super important to us. And I think what we're talking about today is one of our top issues, top of mind. We've been focusing on diversity in clinical trials for years, as long as I've been with NMQF. And this panel today, led by Ashley Zofer, will talk about eliminating policy barriers to diversifying clinical trials. Before we get into the meat and potatoes of the program, I just want to say a couple of things. One, if you have a question that you would like Ashley to ask of our panelists, please put it in the Q&A box, and she will get to this. Hopefully around 15 minutes before the program ends. And then two, if you just want to have comments and talk about what's happening or make folks aware of any program or service or study, please put it in the chat function box. And like I said, Ashley Zofer will be leading the call. Ashley is one of my favorite members of our corporate roundtable. She currently works at Johnson & Johnson, but believe it or not, she believes this issue is much bigger than even J&J. She has been, before coming to work with us in external affairs and organizations like NMQF, she was a teacher for 6 years in the Chicago and the greater Chicagoland area. She is from Illinois, the Chicagoland area, but she went to Miami of Ohio in this little school in Cambridge called Harvard. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Ashley to begin leading this week's webinar. So Ashley.
Well, thank you, Brandon. Just kicking it off, embarrassing me a little bit. But thank you all so much for joining us today just to learn more about how we can eliminate policy barriers to diverse participation in clinical trials. I want to start with just a special thank you to the National Minority Quality Forum for hosting this critical conversation and for all the work that you do and have been doing and continue to do on this issue. As Brandon said, I'm Ashley Zofer with J&J, and I collaborate with our advocacy groups on just issues that impact access, affordability, and health equity for patients. And so much of that work really starts at the very beginning in the research and development stages of new treatments and therapies. So by ensuring that clinical trials are representative of the diverse groups of individuals who will be benefiting from this innovation, we can make sure we're actually reaching those patients and creating some of that better access and equity. Today, we're going to be learning from leaders on the overall clinical trials landscape and why this diverse participation is so critical, as well as just hearing more about some of the current financial and policy barriers that make that access and participation more difficult. We'll also hear about some of the current policy proposals underway to eliminate these barriers so that industry leaders and other stakeholders can provide more support to those potentially interested in participating. And we're also going to hear about some of the tools and resources that are currently available to help patients and their caregivers navigate that finding, enrolling, and participating in trials. So we're going to start today we're going to hear today from Gary Puckrin, President and CEO of the National Minority Quality Forum, Nishith Pandya, who is Director of Federal Relations for the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network, Mark Fleury, who is a policy principal, also from the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network, and Marvell Adams Jr., President and CEO of the Caregiver Action Network. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Gary Puckrin, who's just going to get us started with some opening remarks on the background of the clinical trials landscape and some of the historical barriers and impact that has been made, as well as where we have some more opportunity for progress. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you, Gary.
Thank you so much, Ashley, and again, thank you to J&J and all of the wonderful opportunities that we've worked on together. And also want to thank our friends at ACS CAN. We've done a lot of great work together, and this is just another opportunity to do something really good. And to Marvell, know his work and his organization. They're doing cutting edge stuff, and glad he's able to participate with us. Actually, I want to lean forward a little bit on this clinical trial discussion, because sometimes I don't think we have a good sense of where we are in what I would describe the battlefield. And the battlefield really is the emerging marketplace in the country. So if you start a clinical trial today, the majority of people who are going to use that device or medication is going to be those who we once thought of as minorities. They are the emerging majority. So if you look at California, Texas, Georgia, Florida, Maryland, New Jersey, all of those are becoming majority minority states, right? And so the question is really about safety and efficacy of the medications and devices that come forward. And for those who decide that for whatever reason they don't want to diversify their clinical trials, you will soon find that the marketplace is not going to be able to accommodate you, because what physicians are going to look for and patients are going to look for in their decision making is safety and efficacy of the medications of that being prescribed. And so that's the hard-headed business conversation, because what we're talking now is not a nice to have, but what we're talking about is how do we provide quality healthcare for a diverse America. And what you should also understand about clinical trials, but sometimes we think, well, it's just about manufacturers getting their new drug in the marketplace, et cetera, et cetera. But clinical trials also lays the foundation for clinical guidelines. How do we provide care for people? And those randomized clinical trials are the foundation of the clinical guidelines that are written so that physicians know what is the best possible science to help patients with any particular condition that they might have. And so, you know, demographics is destiny here. And so I say that because sometimes we get confused and we think that maybe clinical trial diversity is some sort of nice to have program, and we don't need to consider it, or maybe it's too hard for me to wrap my brains around. But the hard reality is that as we move forward to provide quality care, equitable care, if you will, to all Americans, clinical trials are foundational. It is where we get our science from, and how we manage disease, and particularly in the cancer space. I want to lean in on this for 2 seconds, and then I promise I'll go away. We're in a medical revolution. We are learning how to screen and identify cancer at stages that heretofore were not possible. Right? We are looking at circulating DNA, multi-cancer early detection screenings, et cetera, et cetera. We need to know that these new technologies and immune therapies actually work in diverse populations if we're going to really address the disproportionate burden of cancer in minority communities. So tremendous opportunity. Salute the work of ACSCAN. Tip of the hat to J&J for recognizing what the future looks like, and Marvell and the great work he's doing by being insistent that we have diversity in clinical trial. All those voices are needed, and your voice is needed too, those who are participating in the clinical trial. And my understanding, you're going to get an opportunity before this session is over to add your voice to what is needed. So thank you very much, and I'm going to give it back.
Thank you so much, as always, Gary, for your incredible wisdom in this space and passion and just continued effort to keep this work moving. And so without further ado, we'll get into some of the meat of this conversation just around what the landscape looks like, what some of those barriers are, and how we're trying to work to address them with some policy right now. So I'm going to go and hand the conversation over to Mark Fleury and Nishith Pandya from ACSCAN. And you guys can take it away and share your screens, as I understand you have slides.
Thanks so much, Ashley, and thanks to NMQF for the opportunity to talk about this really important issue. As Gary mentioned, we've been great partners in the past and really happy about this collaboration. Today, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about a specific piece of legislation that addresses some of the policy barriers that we have identified that keep patients out of clinical trials, and especially barriers that are not experienced equally among populations. So it's the Clinical Trial Modernization Act. And for those of you who followed this for a while, in previous Congress, it was referred to as the Diverse Trials Act. But I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about it. And I want to I guess, preface this with the statement that there are a lot of barriers that keep patients out of clinical trials, and this legislation would not solve them all, but it is one that's very amenable to public policy solutions, and that's what we do here at ACS CAN, is identify public policy levers that we can pull on to make a difference for cancer patients. So next slide, please. So the focus of this legislation is really around the financial barrier that patients face in enrolling in cancer clinical trials. When we look at surveys of why cancer patients may, who are eligible for a trial, may ultimately decide not to enroll, there's a number of reasons, but cost is one of the top 4 most frequently cited reasons. Now, when we talk about costs, and we'll talk about them a little bit more in depth in some coming slides, there's a variety of different costs that may be involved here. There are, for example, non-medical costs. Think about parking, transportation, food, lodging, if you have to go somewhere and stay overnight, for example, for a clinical trial. And so that those non-medical costs can certainly add up. And there's a lot of evidence that shows folks who go to clinical trials tend to travel to more distant sites than their normal care if they were not on a clinical trial. So those are one important sources of cost. Another important source of cost is the medical costs themselves. So obviously, care involves copays and deductibles, and in some cases, uncovered services. And clinical trials typically cover all the experimental portions of your care. But they're often, and especially in oncology, mixed with what we would call routine care that you would get whether you were on a clinical trial or not. And those are typically billed to the insurance company, and so they often have copays, coinsurance, and deductibles associated with that. So patients experience both medical costs and non-medical costs. And importantly, when we look at clinical trial participation, we've done some work that shows that acceptance rates, once a patient is eligible for a clinical trial, are over 50%. So in other words, if you're told you're eligible for a cancer clinical trial, on average, more than half of the people will say, yes, sign me up. And those rates don't vary across Blacks, whites, Asians, or Hispanics. But one place where they do vary, and they vary quite substantially, is based on income level. So there's been research that shows that individuals who come from a family that makes under $50,000 per year are about 30% less likely to say yes to clinical trial participation. So what we have here is a situation where folks who are most, economically vulnerable are the least likely to say yes to a clinical trial. And this is really where this legislation comes in. We've done survey work at ACS CAN that's shown that about almost 80% of patients indicate that if they were to receive financial support on a clinical trial, it would increase their likelihood to say yes. So that and that cuts across income levels. Anybody who has gone through an episode of cancer care knows that the cost can be quite high, regardless of your income bracket. But while we sort of have identified a known barrier, cost is a known barrier, we can demonstrate and describe what that barrier looks like, and we have a potential solution, that is financial support provided by on the part of the sponsor. There are nonetheless some important public policy, regulatory, and legal barriers that both patients face to receiving that support, as well as sponsors may face in providing that support. And so I'll talk in the next couple of slides here about how we address those in this legislation. So next slide. Okay, so first of all, at a high level, the bill does, 4 important things here. First and foremost, it authorizes grants to community organizations that can do education and outreach to underrepresented populations about the importance of clinical trials and how to participate in them. So that is, again, a community grant program. But the next ones are really where we address known barriers. So as I mentioned before, patients face these sometimes additional costs to being in a clinical trial. But for a sponsor to be able to provide that financial support, there is a statute that's known as the anti-kickback statute that essentially prohibits what would be considered kickbacks or bribes to either patients or providers to try and induce them to seek care that might be billable to a federal health agency, for example, Medicare. So you can't slip somebody $100 bill to come in and get some sort of care that they wouldn't have ordinarily gotten. And that has been sometimes interpreted by sponsors as preventing them from supporting patients financially while in a clinical trial. Importantly, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not offering legal advice here, so I want to caveat that. But we know that that's not the supporting patients and sort of making them whole for extra costs on a clinical trial is not the intent of the anti-kickback statute. And in fact, many sponsors today do already provide this kind of financial support to their participants on clinical trials. And to date, the Office of Inspector General of HHS, which is sort of the law enforcement arm, if you will, of HHS, has never brought any charges against any sponsors for doing that. But nonetheless, because it is a gray area, we think it's really important to create a really bright safe harbor from the anti-kickback statute and the corresponding civil monetary statute, which are sort of work hand in glove. That makes it crystal clear that sponsors are not going to be in trouble for helping patients with their non-medical costs. Now, we also have a provision in this bill that makes sure that sponsors can also provide the same kind of support for direct medical costs. So again, that's co-pays, deductibles, and things like that. Now, lastly, and again, we'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail in the next couple of slides, is that there's an important barrier for patients to receive this income. When patients receive financial support from a sponsor, if it is to reimburse for actual expenses, for example, reimbursing for a $30 parking fee at the cancer center, or it's to reimburse for mileage or a hotel room or something like that, that reimbursement is not considered income by the IRS. And many of us who work for organizations, you take a business trip, if you spend money, your company will reimburse you, and there's no tax implications. But in some cases, that need to keep receipts and, what do you pay for? Maybe one person has elder care, another has child care, another has pet care. And so sponsors sometimes will provide just flat stipends per visit and allow the patient to figure out what costs they need to cover. When it's not for a reimbursable event, but rather a stipend or an incentive payment, those can be subject to inclusion in a patient's annual income, and there is a rule that says any payments over $600 have to be reported to the IRS. So what we've found is that using what I would consider a very patient-friendly approach to supporting patients financially, just give them a stipend and don't let them worry about the receipts. While that's very patient-friendly, it can introduce tax liabilities for patients. And we've heard a lot of other issues besides just paying tax on that is obviously your income determines your eligibility for things like Medicaid or marketplace insurance subsidies. And so sort of perversely, the folks who need this the most could be at risk by accepting this financial support of actually cutting off their lifeline of their health insurance. And so again, not the intent here. Our intent is to make patients whole and offset their costs. So there is a provision in the legislation that would create a carve out for that. So next slide. So again, the next few slides are just going to dive a little bit deeper into some of these provisions, gave a high-level overview. And again, we sort of on these slides have a comparison to Diverse Trials Act. If you're not familiar with it, you can sort of ignore that comparison, but many of you were familiar or helped support the Diverse in past Congresses. But this first, again, just to review statutory safe harbor from the anti-kickback statute and the civil monetary penalty statute. Again, the only difference that these two statutes do the same thing. They prevent kickbacks. One has a penalty that is criminal and one that's civil. So it creates a carve out so that sponsors can provide support for travel, parking, lodging, food, those kinds of things. Also, I didn't mention before, but for tech tools. So obviously in today's day and age, there's an increasing use of decentralized trials where maybe a patient can fill out, symptom surveys or something in the comfort of their home or log in to do sort of video check-ins. But if a patient doesn't have the right technology to do that on their own, this says it's okay to, for example, give them an iPad for use during the trial that's not considered sort of a bribe or a kickback. And then, as I mentioned before, something that's new in the most recent version of the legislation is that there's the same safe harbor for direct medical costs. Next slide. And then again, because there are barriers on the patient sides to receiving financial support, again, taxation on what to use the technical term, unsubstantiated payments. So these are, again, payments that aren't supported by receipts. They're not reimbursement. They're stipends or incentives. It creates a safe harbor from considering those payments for income. Now, importantly, what you'll see here is that it's not a blanket exemption. It is a specified $2,000 safe harbor. So for each patient, the first $2,000 in unsubstantiated payment would be exempt from income. And again, unlimited amount of substantiated or those supported by receipts. Now, folks have asked us why $2,000, why not unlimited? I guess the most important is that the sponsors of the legislation have requested that. But lest you become too concerned about that, we've partnered with allies here. Greenfire is a third-party payments vendor who manages a lot of these kinds of payments. And when they look in their data, that covers 98% of oncology patients. So this amount right now is inclusive of the majority of patients. And there's also an existing $2,000 safe harbor in statute for a slightly different purpose. It's for calculating SSI eligibility, and it applies to patients on trials for rare diseases. So again, we're sort of tying this back to some legislation. Next slide. Okay, and then as I mentioned before, there is a community grant program similar to Diverse. And again, for those of you familiar with Diverse, it did have a requirement for FDA to issue guidance on decentralized trials, which is another way to get trials out and deeper into the community. But fortunately for us, that provision has been passed into law already. So just to recap, and one thing I should have maybe said earlier, but I want to stress here is that in this legislation, we tie these safe harbors specifically back to a provision of the Affordable Care Act called Section 2709, which that section requires private insurance plans to pay for the routine care costs of clinical trials for any patient who has cancer or a life-threatening disease. And so the idea is, as I mentioned before, if you're on a clinical trial, there are some routine care costs that you still incur outside of the experimental portions. And that provision said that insurers have to actually cover those the same way they would any other coverage. And so because this is sort of the anchor of current clinical trial coverage and access issues, this legislation similarly ties these safe harbors back to that same section, which, to be clear, means that these provisions, other than the community grant program, all apply to cancer and life-threatening diseases, but it doesn't apply to every disease, but only cancer and life-threatening diseases. And so with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to my partner, Nishit Pandya. He'll talk a little bit about sort of the status of the legislation and the Hill dynamics. And I think there's a Q&A session towards the end of the webinar. We're happy to take questions. So Nishit, take it away.
Thanks so much, Mark, and thank you all for joining us today. So as Mark mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Hill dynamics and where we are. So as you see on the slide here, this bill was first introduced as in its current form back in May of this year. It was referred to both the Energy and Commerce and Ways and Means committees. Our bill sponsors, who are Congressman Ruiz from California and Congressman Bouchon of Indiana, both serve on Energy and Commerce. Some of you may know Congressman Bouchon is retiring at the end of this Congress, so we are working to find a lead sponsor both for Energy and Commerce Republicans as well as for Ways and Means Democrat and Republicans. And we're also looking for some new leadership in the Senate. We had originally planned on a bicameral, bipartisan introduction. The Senate kind of fell off of the path with presidential year politics, among other things. So we're working to get the train back on the tracks there, and we have some promising leads that we'll be working towards there. So what we've been doing since the bill's introduction, we've been working with our partners on Hill education, just really bringing, I mean, the Hill has turned over a lot in this Congress, excuse me, both at the member level and the staff level. So really getting folks up to speed on what this bill does, why it's important, and how it helps patients. We also want to make sure that there is a familiarity and understanding in the patient advocacy and public health sphere as well. I think there's been a little bit of a misunderstanding about what the bill does, why it's being introduced, and really just want folks to know that this is a patient benefit, and this is really a centric legislation. So all this is laying that foundation for the 119th Congress. As I mentioned, we're looking to build support and find some lead sponsors on both chambers and across the committee lines to really shepherd this bill through the Congress, and hopefully we'll have an early introduction. We really want folks to give us feedback if they have feedback on this bill, and we'll try to get that incorporated to make sure we have as strong a base as possible and as strong an approach and a unified approach as possible. And to that end, we also are circulating a support letter for the CTMA. The deadline to sign on is October 31st. So after the webinar is done, everyone who's registered, you'll get an email from me with a PDF that has text of the letter and the Microsoft Forms link to sign on. We're at about 75 signatories right now, and really love to get all your organizations on to show there is broad and widespread support, and this is a patient-centered bill. And with that, am I going to Q&A or am I turning it back to you, Ashley? Sorry.
No, you can go ahead and turn it back to me,
Okay.
because we'll do Q&A at the end, because I know one of the
Sounds good.
questions we have now, I think is well suited to be answered by a number of people on this, and I assume some of the other questions might be as well. But thank you guys so much for that fantastic detailed overview of what's happening and what we're trying to do about it. And to just kind of echo and reiterate Nishit's point, we wanted this to get as much broad reach as possible. This is really about how we can better serve patients and improve access. So if there are more questions after this panel, then we can't answer just on this call, please do still direct them to us so that we can make sure we're informing you and your organization so that we can get as much support for this as possible. And then switching gears for a moment and just thinking about this more broadly beyond just the legislation, I want to turn it over to Marvell Adams Jr., who is the CEO of the Caregiver Action Network. And they are doing some really incredible work just on the clinical trials landscape and why this is important to them, and really bringing in, I think, a group that's sometimes not the focal point, which is the caregivers themselves. And so many caregivers are the ones who will be helping to navigate this space. So we're going to turn it over to Marvell to just give kind of an overview of some of that work and how you can take advantage of that. So I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashley, and thanks to the National Minority Quality Forum for having me as a part of today's webinar. So as Ashley mentioned, my name is Marvell Adams Jr. I serve as CEO of Caregiver Action Network, which is a not-for-profit based in Washington, D.C., but with a national reach. We support the resources, advocacy, and as well as training and education and guidance caregivers across the country, and in all 50 states, and across really all age spans, as well as disease and condition individuals may be having. So, the reason I'm here today is that there is such a huge need for caregivers to really be partners when it comes to diversifying clinical trials, because not only to recognize that this underrepresentation, impacts the loved one that they are supporting, but also recognizing that a caregiver is an influencer, an individual many times is perhaps looking for the clinical trials, doing the research themselves, influencing some of the decision making, but also they're there each time with the understanding the challenges that the loved one they're supporting is going through, and recognizing, maybe sometimes they feel it may not be worth it. Maybe they're frustrated already with a health system that wasn't designed with them in mind. And so clinical trial diversification really is a complex issue, but it is one that really as caregivers, in our opinion, at the center of the solution. So, everything I'm going to talk about today, you can go and check out at our website, caregiveraction.org. Under our resources section, we have a whole entire section on clinical trials. It's essentially what you need to do in order to support your loved one, considering a clinical trial, going through a clinical trial, all aspects of it. But some of the common barriers we've talked about already is just a lack of awareness and understanding of clinical trials. And so we really try to take a proactive role of giving people a one-stop shop access when it comes to clinical trial and understanding information, everything from knowing what phases and what they mean, but also just a very one click that'll take you straight to the website on clinical trials that has all of them listed for individuals. Fear and mistrust amongst the medical research and community and pharmaceutical companies is a real thing. And in our opinion, it is something when it comes to talking with caregivers and talking with the ones that they support, it's really paramount that that be recognized, that it not be something that is kind of brushed under the rug or that is ignored or seen as not as a part of this dialogue when it comes to recruitment for clinical trials. It's absolutely at the center of it. And one of the things that I really forcefully talk about is that one of the other aspects for particularly Black individuals in this country, recognizing the number of individuals that have really given their lives, given their genetic DNA, like Henrietta Lacks, given up their quality of life and the loved ones that have impacted, perhaps as they suffered or passed away after unethical practices. There is no way of stating that someone deserves a clinical trial more than another, because that's not the case. But what is deserved for sure is that an absence of diversity in clinical trials really is a loss in all of the difficult, challenging, and really sacrificial work of individuals before that perhaps didn't have as much of an ethical treatment throughout the process. So understanding logistical challenges are really a part of this, and so glad to really hear about the some of the parts of the bill that is for consideration, and in taking into consideration just the cost of that. But also keeping in mind language and cultural barriers during the trial communication, and an overall cultural competency, which is a big part of what we have to consider when talking about diversity throughout our health system, but particularly when it comes to aspects of actually needing to recruit individuals into a clinical trial. As we heard earlier, 50% of the people across any, race or nationality, ethnicity will say yes if asked about a clinical trial. But does that mean that the cultural competency of the person doing the asking, the advertisement for it, the outreach for it, all of that has to be taken into consideration, and language and cultural barriers are a big part of that. And then also just mentioning that, caregivers, they face challenges themselves. They, number one, want to be for their loved one, be there for them. Sometimes it means they're a long distance caregiver and they're coming into town and taking the person to, a clinical trial someplace else at a third point. But understand that they are going to be balancing their own priorities and responsibilities, and then really understanding that their ability to have access to accurate and easy to understand information that's in layman's terms or layperson's terms is really important. So the other thing I'll mention is the resources that can support a caregiver and their loved one. We have a whole repository on our website. I'll put in the chat right now so folks can have it. But you also can go in and just navigate it to it from our main page. But it's simply caregiveraction.org/clinical trials. And really the biggest part of that I really advocate for people to take a look at is because, you many times don't know what you don't know. The other day I realized, talking on a panel, I've been doing this for a while, that I really couldn't articulate the differences in the phases for someone. Like if I was talking with a family member and they said, well, what do you think of the phases? I would probably need to look it up. Now, granted, I know where to go for that information. But that's part of understanding that, anyone that's going to a clinical trial as a caregiver, as a loved one, there are going to be aspects of this that you just don't know. And so we really try to put ourselves in a position to be that single point entry of information that's third party, that's not really is agnostic on the clinical trial themselves, but really about ensuring that there's diversity and there's equity in trying to do that for clinical trials and with folks educational guides we also offer on our website. So that can be everything from 10 tips you need to know as a caregiver. So you're a long distance caregiver, this is what you consider. You're a new time caregiver, you're an episodic caregiver, and that really comes in to play for individuals for many clinical trials because this clinical trial may be the third, fourth, or fifth thing they've tried. This may be a second, third, or fourth iteration of their disease coming back, which will be in remission. There's so many different aspects of understanding that a caregiver's role by comparison pales in comparison perhaps to the person that's going through the clinical trial, but recognizing that they really are in a role that needs to be highly educated with what's going on and resources available. Speaking of resources, one of the things we offer at Caregiver Action Network that I think, if I point correctly, you can see the phone number that's there, but that's our help desk. And essentially, that's if someone has questions about anything, and that includes clinical trials. And so a caregiver could call us or web chat with us on our website or send us an email, and we will help find them the proper information, direct them to the right resources, and just kind of help them as we can. Or it could be that someone's just really frustrating and they themselves are having a mental health crisis and trying to navigate really what happens next for the individual. Maybe they've been disappointed how they've seen themselves treated within the system, or just not having things go the way they want it to. Also, really, we put out there if there are partnerships we have going on within clinical trials, we try to make sure that we put that out there for everyone's knowledge so that there's information that's really clear and transparent for everybody. And also making sure that whether you use Caregiver Action Network or not, making sure that there's clinicaltrials.gov that you can go out to that is a repository of information. There's also trialmatch.alz.org that focuses mainly on dementia and Alzheimer's, but there's a whole wealth of information, including things that ACS can. The other thing that I'll just mention is, platforms for patients and caregivers out there to learn about clinical trials exist in many of the different areas I just talked about. We actually launched a few months ago after some really great feedback from some caregiver roundtables, a Facebook. Because more and more we are really advocating and pushing our resources into the realm of more accessible really means meeting caregivers where they and so when it comes to clinical trials, we're doing that as well and making sure that an individual can just be on their Facebook feed and see information on our caregiver support group or caregiver community that exists within Facebook. It's a closed group, and so people can really be vulnerable should they so choose. They can ask questions about, I've heard about the clinical trial. Does anybody else know anything about it? And really have a conversation in a way that perhaps they don't feel comfortable having with their loved one that they're supporting or their doctor or someone else, but really getting that empathy from someone that may be a fellow caregiver that's going through some of these difficulties. So, lastly, I'll just say making sure and collaborating with healthcare providers, that's a big part of what we do as well and trying to make it easier. And so part of what we do is also educating providers on the roles of caregivers and how to do that outreach, how to understand what culturally competent training looks like when it comes to the trial coordinators and medical staff and really understanding the caregiver perspective. So, one thing I'll just leave you with is understanding that, encouraging not only that connection between caregivers and healthcare providers is a big part of ensuring diversification in clinical trials, but also advocating for the policy that you just heard about today. That is a big part of ensuring that clinical trials are accessible and clinical trials are equitable. But lastly, I just really want to thank everybody for their time and effort in bringing this together, but also just recognizing that Gary put it very succinctly at the beginning. We are diversifying as a country in leaps and bounds. And as he said, the clinical trials going on right now, the majority of the individuals that will benefit from that will take that drug that will have that treatment will be from a more diverse background than we've seen ever in our country's history. Starting in 2040, you start to have not only a huge diversification in the older adult population. Right now, Gen Xers are far more diverse than their parents were. and millennials are already a majority of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so recognizing this diversity really is also from a case of diversification and inclusion, a paramount thing that has to take place. So just thank everybody for the time, and I'll turn it back over to Ashley.
Thank you so much, Marvell. And I think you did such a great job kind of connecting all of these dots, because one of the really big things we think about when we talk about the diversity in clinical trials landscape is that it's really not just about one lever that we can pull to make a big difference. And so I think having the Gary and Marvell and our ACS CAN team on this call actually just showed a lot of the different ways that we're engaging in this work, whether it's through the policy barriers, which is kind of the specific focus of this piece, but also not just those resources and tools, but meeting people where they are, working with caregivers. And that actually lends itself really well to the first question that came in, which is from Avinas Gines. And it's, according to the EDICT program, the two most significant barriers to participating in a clinical trial is information and communication, which I think definitely was touched upon by all of you today in various ways. But then their point is we need more community health workers as clinical trials navigators. And I think that while that is a statement, I don't know if there's anything we want to, if anyone has something to add on how they might be thinking about that or working with community health workers. But we do know, I mean, from our work at J&J, we do a lot to support community health workers and the community health workforce and helping them get access to resources. As we understand, in many communities, those community health workers are kind of that first line of defense and the most trusted provider of information and communication. So I don't know if anyone, we can just kind of open that up, but if there's anyone on this call who had some insights into that work or has anything they want to add to that, I think it ties really well into what you were saying about working with the providers themselves and the physicians and how people are getting access to that information where they are.
Actually, I'll just mention just briefly that, one of the ways that we reach caregivers, because we have, over 40,000 caregivers in our network and growing, that we have to meet individuals where they are from a culturally competent standpoint. And so going into churches, going into senior centers, and really, whether it's where it's the trial coordinators themselves, or, an individual that is going through a trial, and inviting their trial coordinator in to speak to their constituency, because there really is a trust factor that cannot be ignored. And so when it comes to those public health workers, those community health workers, it is really paramount that they be seen as someone that is there to support the community. And the best way to do that is to invite them in, or to put the onus, on the clinical trial runners, that you really do have to get to know the organization by being on the ground there.
Fantastic. And this person that asked the question just added, our organization has a certified training program for community health workers as clinical trials navigators, and did include that link in the chat for everyone. And I'll just reiterate, we will follow up this conversation with links to the resources we mentioned, the sign-on letter, but also we can include some of these links that people might be including in the chat as well. So thank you for sharing that great resource. The next question is from an anonymous attendee, but just asking if we could expand more upon the clinical trial decentralization efforts that are underway. I know we talked a bit about that, but I don't know if maybe the ACS CAN team has any additional perspective on that they want to share.
Sure, happy to jump in here. I mean, I think just I think folks who've been in this field for a while, I'm struck by how for years we talked about decentralization as a potential solution to access issues. We've done a lot of research looking at where clinical trials are open, and it's not surprising to anybody here that they're open in more urban areas and they're not open in less populated areas. And certainly decentralization is one of those ways we can potentially get at some of those less populated areas. In oncology, what we find is that it's hard to completely decentralize a trial, often because, if the trial involves sort of an infusion or radiation or something like that, you have to come in for those things, right? But some of the check-ins or the local, the lab draws and stuff can happen in more local areas. Well, as many, folks know, what we went from talking about trial decentralization and just talking about it, and then the pandemic happened, and suddenly folks found a way to make it happen. So it was no longer theoretical. It was like, it was existential. You had to do it if you wanted to keep your trial going. and folks found a way. And, FDA and NCI, were very flexible. I mentioned before that we had been pushing for guidance from FDA, and that guidance is now out. And so, the regulatory and funding agencies are much more open to it. I think what we've seen is that once the urgency of having to do it fell away, that many of the sponsors kind of dropped some of their forward-leaning efforts on this and have gone back to trials in a more standardized way. But I think what we've learned coming out of the pandemic is that it's possible. It's not necessarily easy or sort of natural to do, so it still takes more effort on the sponsors and the sites parts to make sure that this happens. But there is a more permissive environment, and I think it's really still about changing hearts and minds. And again, as I mentioned before, our focus is on oncology, and for the most part, what we see is this reduces the travel burden, but not eliminates it. But there are many other types of clinical trials and disease areas where a trial could be, for example, completely decentralized. Even within the cancer space, we've seen 100% decentralized screening trials where, screening like stool tests have been sent out, and then they've done their colonoscopy with a local provider, and it's all decentralized. So just as a heads up, I just want to flag that, we've seen some progress, some more permissiveness. Some of the limitations are, sort of comfort and willingness, and just the nature of the disease, whether you have to have a bricks and mortar place or not.
Yeah, I think, and I'll just add quickly onto that too. I think that's where some of the pieces around the anti-kickback statute really do come into place, because if sponsors are allowed to provide things like wearable technology, there could be more elements that maybe somebody doesn't need to come in person for if they are able to monitor themselves because they've been able to receive that technology without having it be an additional cost to them. So that's a little bit of one of the issues that policy tries to address too.
Yeah,
And
actually, I was gonna basically get to that point, but I think building on what you said, I think there's a strong bipartisan interest in seeing this from a political perspective, because both Ruiz and Bouchon, California, Indiana, you wouldn't think they have much in common, but they have huge swaths of their district are very rural, and we know there's an overlap between rural populations and underserved populations. So this is not a partisan or a geographic exercise or anything. There's a broad interest in expanding access for rural populations and other underserved populations as well.
we have another question that came in from Kate Wilson. As part of advocating for this bill, is there data published to help quantify and tell the story of the impact of these financial barriers to participation in clinical trials? For example, percentage of participants who have declined participation in clinical trials due to income tax requirements, percentage of patients who dropped out of trials early or prior to the $600 limit to avoid the income tax reporting, and then suggesting that perhaps Greenfire has this data from many of the studies and sites they work with. I don't know if you guys have any insights into that.
Unfortunately, we don't have that granular of data. We have average receipt of support, but not necessarily. We have anecdotal data, of folks who have, been receiving support and they realized they were getting close, and they've asked to stop, or they've asked if they can refund the money that they've gotten, which at that point is really hard to do. So we have sort of some studies and case studies and stories, but in terms of, we know how many people today make over $600 and therefore in theory are subject to taxation. Now, how many of those, opted to drop out of the trial? We don't have that data. We do, as I mentioned, we did a survey on sort of, what impact support would have. And so we published those data. And we have, we are in the process of collecting data around, sort of travel burden and costs while in clinical trials, and comparing those to people who are not in clinical trials. So we are trying to continue to collect quantifiable data and evidence to provide support around this, but the level of granularity asked in the question, we don't necessarily have that granular of data.
Perfect, thank you. Well, those are all the questions that have come through. If there are anything else that people want to say, they could either, raise your hand or put a question through right now. But I will just go ahead and say thank you so much to all of our panelists, not only for participating in this conversation and bringing this to a new platform, but also just for all of the work that's already underway and what we continue to do. To Gary's original point about, this is a solvable problem and we need to be working together to do that. We all, I think, understand how imperative this work is, but I just really want to say once again, thank you to all of these groups and to those who joined the conversation online and who are trying to get involved in this more. We really do appreciate it. I think there's so much opportunity here for people to work together and really collaborate. I always think of this as one of those issues that really does benefit everybody. There's no kind of other side of this equation, right? We can't argue that diversity in clinical trials is a bad thing. So the more that we can come together on this work, the better. And we will, as we said, be following up from this conversation with just an email with some of those resources that people have shared in the chat, the link to the sign-on letter and the bill text, and just some of the one pager that you created, ACS Can, I think would be helpful just to give people kind of that handout. And I think the biggest thing is to ask that people this can be shared. If you were able to join this conversation today and some other groups who maybe weren't or who weren't privy to it, please do share those with your networks, ask questions, reach out. This is something we're all working together on and are not going to hesitate to jump in. So I just want to reiterate that and thank everybody else for joining this. I think, we're seeing some other links come into the chat that we'll make sure to capture. But with that, I just will say a final thank you. I don't know, Brandon, if you want to just say goodbye or anything else, but I just wanted to acknowledge everyone's participation and once again, thank everyone. Okay, well, thank you all so much.